pandemic that quarantined my ancestor. So first things first, technically this isn't a picture of my ancestor, but it is a picture of a German immigrant from the 19th century. So for all points and purposes, this is close to what she looked like. And she was 8 at the time that all of this happened. She is my great-great-great-great-grandmother. So my 4th great-grandmother. And her name is Elizabeth Agnes Sheets, and she was born in 1839 in Germany. She was born the youngest child of Christopher and Margaret Sheets, and she had 3 older siblings, Johann, maybe Johanna, I'll explain that later, Sheets, Stuart Sheets, and Margaret Sheets. She then later had 2 younger siblings, so she was then 4 out of 6 children. Her younger brother Christopher Sheets was born 4 years after her, and then her other younger brother Walter Sheets was born 2 years after Christopher, so he was born in 1845. Around 1845 is when the Troubles started. So, and it has to deal with a food that we are all very familiar with, the potato. So, potatoes were not always a super popular food in Europe. It's technically from Peru and Bolivia, so it's not native to Europe, but it was brought to Europe by way of the Spanish explorers in the 16th century. So by the time Elizabeth was born, potatoes were everywhere. Now, if you think this is going to be about the Irish potato famine, hold on, we're not there yet. This is the potato revolts of 1847 in Germany. So there were a lot of problems going on. Harvests had been poor in 1845 and 1846. There was a potato blight that's connected to the Irish potato famine, and just like as a result of all of these scarcities, everything was significantly more expensive. And so everyone was struggling a lot. And during this time period, a lot of Germans immigrated to the United States, and that is what Elizabeth and her entire family did. So when Elizabeth was about 8, Christopher and Margaret decided to pack up their things and move. I don't know the exact route that they would have took, but I can tell you the route that they probably took. So wherever they were living at the time, as I'm not quite sure, the records don't indicate where she was born, they would have started their journey in Bremen. So Bremen is a town in Germany that is on the Wessen River, and so they would have followed the Wessen River, and lots of people left by way of Bremen. It was the preferred port at the time. A couple of years afterwards, people started switching to another port, Hamburg, but yeah, they probably started at Bremen. They traveled from Bremen on the Weser River to the North Sea, through the Dover Strait, and through the English Channel to arrive at Liverpool. And here is where the trouble starts. And like most trouble, it's not as though you can blame one specific person or one specific group of people. Now here's where the Irish potato famine comes in. This time, that same blight that had caused the potato revolts in Germany caused the Irish potato famine in Ireland, and so lots of Irish people were poor. There was a combination of English government rules and general poverty and people who were already on the brink of starvation now just being completely uprooted and thrown into starvation. And so all of these poor people decided to immigrate to the United States, and the port to do that from was Liverpool. And because there were so many people who were trying to immigrate to the United States all at once, there was not enough housing in Liverpool to allow people to stay in sanitary conditions before they could go off to the United States. So Elizabeth and her family arrived in Liverpool, and from Liverpool they then took a ship to the United States. This is an image of what that ship probably looked like. At the time, they were still predominantly using sails instead of steam-powered ships, so the journey probably would have taken, depending on the weather, 6 to 14 weeks, which is a long time. And again, these people are, especially the Irish immigrants, have not been able to take care of themselves. They have been starving. People were crammed together very, 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 very tightly. And all of these conditions proved to be optimal conditions for the breeding of lice. And lice is not just a problem that animals have, humans also have it if they are packed together very tightly in unsanitary conditions. And oh look, that's what they had been suffering through in Liverpool, and now on this ship, the Pontiac. On the way, there were 215 passengers, and many of them became sick with the plague at the time that was ravaging particularly the Irish population, Typhus Fever. And Typhus Fever came from those body lice among these people who are weakened by malnutrition and huddled together for warmth and just trying to survive, and they can't get clean. And so this plague of typhus, which at the time medicine was incapable of curing, was flooding all of the immigrant population and then arriving in New York. Some quotes from the time by Thomas Kennelly. The dead were dragged out of the holds with hooks and stacked like cordwood on the shore. On the 29th of July, 1847, one man described a continuous line of boats, each carrying its freight of dead to the burial ground. Some had several corpses, so tied up in canvas that the stiff, sharp outline of death was easily traceable. This was a horrible plague that was going on. Many sick people, many people were dying. On the Pontiac ship that my ancestors took, captained by George Tucker Wallace and William Parker, on the way, of their 215 passengers, 18 died. 2 of them were English immigrants, 10 of them were Irish immigrants, and 6 of them were German immigrants. And one of them was Elizabeth Sheets' father, Christopher Sheets. Now, can you imagine? Take a second. You're fleeing an incredibly rough, impoverished, hopeless situation. You're leaving everyone that you know behind. As far as I can tell, there were no Sheets already in the United States. And at the time, the dangers of this travel were known. Generally, out of 100 passengers, it was averaged that 10 would die on the journey. This was a deadly period in history. It's not just the uprooting of your entire lives, there are also dangers involved, serious health risks, and they still took that risk. But Christopher Sheets died on the journey of typhus fever. Then, when they arrived in New York, the ship had to be quarantined in New York. New York had this law at the time that stated, "Quarantine for the protection of public health shall be maintained in and for the ports of New York. All vessels arriving thereat from other ports, and for the crews, passengers, equipage, cargoes, and other property on board the same." This allowed New York state officials to check in and see if everybody was healthy. They basically had no other choice but to wait it out until there were no sick people on board the ship, and then everyone could be let off. So if there were sick passengers on board, generally the ship had to remain in quarantine for 30 days. Once they did wait it out, they were allowed to leave the ship. but they did so with the main breadwinner of their family, Elizabeth's father, Christopher Sheets, being dead. Now this is where that point of either Johann or Johanna Sheets. So on the passenger list, it's marked as Johanna, but the gender is marked as male. So either they wrote down the name correctly, Johanna, in which case she would be a girl, or this was a male child and maybe the name was Johann or Johannes, and the people weren't familiar enough with German names and so messed up the spelling, which, as I mentioned in my census video, was a very common occurrence at the time. If Johann is a boy, and that would make him 20 years old, he could potentially work to provide for the family, but they had Elizabeth, who was 8. There was her younger brother, Christopher Sheets, who was only 4 at the time, and then her younger brother, Walter Sheets, was 2. So Margaret Sheets, her mother, needed to be home with the children and cooking and taking care of the house. That was women's primary role at the time. Childcare was expensive then, and it's expensive now, so even if she wanted to, she couldn't go out and find a job. If Johann is actually Johanna, the next oldest son would be Stuart Sheets, and Stuart Sheets would have been 10 at the time. So this is a terrible financial situation in a completely new country where they presumably don't know the language, with their main breadwinner gone. Despite all of this, Elizabeth Sheets still survives. When I was 8, I moved houses, and I was still incredibly disoriented from that. I can't imagine moving countries at 8 years old. And on top of that, she lost her father to a horrible disease, putting her family in an extremely precarious financial situation. Despite all of this, Elizabeth Sheets still survives. We pick up her story a little further down the road. Okay, so yes, she was in the borough of Chambersburg in Franklin, Pennsylvania. She was domestic help in Geographicus house in 1860. The next information I have about her is the birth of her first son, Edward McKee Babner, who is the child that the rest of my family comes from. So, some point between 1860 and 1864, she meets Frederick Charles Babner, also an immigrant from Germany, and he had just finished up with his short service in the Civil War, so he had to have met Elizabeth Sheets, married her, and then they had their first son in 1864. She started creating this beautiful family that she could call her own, where her children would not have to grow up in the same difficult financial situations that she had grown up in. And she wasn't just reliant on other people. She went out and found herself a job. She was a strong woman in my family. This story of Elizabeth Sheets, yes, there were hardships. Yes, there was tragedy. But there was also new life and new opportunity. And she came out okay. So I want us to take away that whenever we are in a situation like this, whether it's now or in the future, that our ancestors went through this. They didn't like it. This is not the first time, in all likelihood, your family has experienced something like this. They made it through, clearly, or else you wouldn't be here today. So we'll make it through. And I can't wait to see what kind of beautiful families and futures come after. So let me know, have you ever researched your family tree, found any cool histories let me know, have your ancestors ever been quarantined, anything like that? Do you have any interesting quarantine stories from right now? Let me know.